Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation. So let's see, where do we start? Everyone has their learning story, right? We've got different life experiences that we had these moments of realization or questioning or doubt. And for me, I grew up in Alaska. So I grew up in a place where, in my opinion, looking back on it, people pretty much go there to get away from the problems of the rest of the world because, well, then you don't need to deal with it. And there was this thing that occurred to me, this idea that if you are always leaving the problems, then the problem just continues to build up. So for me, I was in school through 4th grade, and my best friend had moved away, and we started dissecting frogs and sheep eyes, and I just thought that was awful. And I had my first male teacher, which was, I think, part of it also, but at that same year, they introduced whole word phonetics to the elementary school when my sister was going to be starting school, and she wasn't reading yet. I'd been reading in kindergarten, and my sister wasn't reading yet. So that was another family controversy. So my parents decided to start homeschooling my sister simply to help develop her reading skills because they didn't think she was ready for school yet. And then I had this wretched 4th grade experience. And so I thought, well, if I just leave school for a year, get my breath back, and then I'll go back and it'll be great, and yay. And it was awful. It was absolutely awful, but it was a lot of our family, I think, working through the things that my parents had experienced. So we started out with the Catholic curriculum, where we basically sent us tests and books, and then we do it, and then we send it back. And Mom and I just got into one battle after another about whether or not we should start at 9 o'clock in the morning. And I figured, if I'm at home, why should I start at 9 when I can start at 9:15? And then I was just completely dissatisfied and thought, this isn't working either. I'd been a great student, so the problem that I was running into is that I had already been at the top of my class since the time I started school in kindergarten. So from kindergarten to 4th grade, I'd always been at the top of my class. And that sense of competition and always being better than everybody, that was what I knew. So when I left that experience, I didn't really have a lot of intrinsic motivation at that point, because I was looking for, well, who do I compare myself to? Who do I know that I'm better than? How do I know that I am any good if I don't have somebody else to be better than? Or how do I know what to strive for if I don't have someone else I'm competing against, right? How does this work?
Right.
So I think that was a lot of it, of really having to, what we talk about, the deschooling or the detoxing experience. So I think that was what happened for a little bit. And then I wanted to go back to school. And I realized that my dad wasn't about to let me go back to school, and I thought that was awful. And then I went into a profound depression in junior high. But then a friend showed me a book called The Teenage Liberation Handbook, How to Quit School and Get a Real Life in Education by Grace Llewellyn. Highly recommended. It was my Bible for the next decade.
Wow.
And she's a retired English teacher who writes about how she had these great classes and they'd go on these amazing trips. And she figured out that of all the things she wanted to do to create an experience of learning, she was mostly just trying to keep kids in line and keep them from misbehaving, and this couldn't possibly be the answer. So she wrote this whole book about how you would go about negotiating your life. And that was awesome, and it was fantastic and great after that, and especially once I got to the time of high school. This is a small town in Alaska, and I had this realization that I was starting to have a really interesting life, and that I could actually navigate my path, and that I could make decisions that would really define who I was in the world for the rest of my life. At the same time that I was hanging out with my friends who were starting to smoke a lot of pot and drink a lot of beer around the campfire out in the middle of the woods, right? This is our rite of passage this day and age.
Right.
But I realized when I was in high school, I had a friend say to me, he says, I've always been a good student, and now I basically am waiting for college, and I'm treading water. And we were sophomores at the time, and I thought, wow, that is the saddest thing I ever heard. To be 15, really, all of the developmental research says that this is the time of your life to define yourself and get out and have experiences, and you are self-admittedly saying, there's really nothing for me here, and I just have to wait till I get to college in order to have some kind of direction. And then you combine that with starting to look around and find out your friends are kind of depressed. And yes, they're starting to experiment sexually, but it doesn't seem terribly purposeful. It seems very random, and it seems like you're developing some maturity and some idea of who you are in the world and a sense of yourself, while your friends around you are kind of hitting the skids. So when I went to college having been out of formal classroom for 8 years.
Wow.
And I went to a state university, and they admitted me to the honors program. They hired me as a resident assistant my freshman year because I'd taken 1 year off to go to college. And they gave me a scholarship that covered pretty much all room and board. So between the job and the scholarship, I was set, and I had it made. And I had an admissions counselor say to me, like, what were they thinking? You haven't been in a classroom for 8 years. I've been in a community college class for a couple of credits to just kind of get back into it. And it was a tough year, but to have an admissions director, it was one of the admissions directors who said to me, like, what were they thinking to let you in and hire you as an RA? What is that about? And so I had all this other, then I had a 3.0 GPA to keep up and all of this. But the thing for me that was amazing and wonderful is that I had an opportunity to be out in the world and really test myself doing those things. And to be able to do it, having had 8 years out of that formal, somebody else telling me what to do, meant that I now needed to figure out what that meant in the university. And for me, the university experience was incredibly disillusioning because I was basically going to school, even in the honors program, I was going to school with a bunch of college students that were basically doing the same thing started doing when they were 12 and 13 and 14 and 15, and now they're in the honors program. And I had brilliant friends that would drink a fifth of Jack Daniels the night before their midterm, and that's how they got through their semester, right? So, for parents that are looking at their kids and they're thinking like, I remember when I had a happy kid, or I remember what it was like for me when I was in school. I think it can be hard for parents when you feel like, you made it through, and there's a certain amount of character you want your kids to have. Like if you're going to live a full life, you need to have some struggle. You don't want it to be too easy. And then I think sometimes, the parental urge is you want it to be easier for your kids than it was for you, and we got to work these things out and make our own decisions. But when you start to look at what moves the world forward, how many of us think that robots are really where it's at? And so for me, when you just look at the college question alone, or the socialization question, or all the different things, like really thinking through what is it about this different option that freaks me out? What is it exactly? Because I think it's different for every person based on where you're at, but the opportunity to make those choices for yourself and make those choices as a parent for what you want, what you see as success, what you define as success. Because if you're really committed to following the track because that's what's worked before, then that's what you're stuck with, basically. And if the plane's not going to get you to your destination, why are you still sitting on it? That's credit to Seth Godin. So Seth Godin is this guy from Buffalo, where I now live, and he's writing about the ways our worlds have so fundamentally, completely changed, and that it's actually important to be weird now, because all of the factory model of how to produce things quickly and cheaply and efficiently is something that's already happened. So we've created this entire school system to fill where we were at that point in time, and the world is fundamentally different. Sir Ken Robinson, one of the most widely viewed speakers on the TED Talks, wonderful, wonderful speaker anyway, highly recommend it. But he talks about, like, we used to grow up in the same neighborhood as our grandparents. And that's not the case. So in a matter of just 2 or 3 generations, we now have access to a massive world. And yet in the US specifically, we have opportunities of resources and freedoms, things that we take completely for granted that other countries don't even have the time to think about because they're dealing with the fact that their neighborhood's getting bombed, or, there's things happening in the world that break your heart every day, and in the US we have an opportunity to do something different. So do we want to be a nation of robots that just do what we're told? Or do we want to be a nation of really dynamic, enthusiastic, self-aware people who are very conscious that we have a responsibility for the choices we make, and that having that responsibility is actually a great opportunity? Now I'm in Buffalo, and I've got this Learning Choices Network that I've developed because for me, being a girl in Alaska, I had things that I wanted to pursue and places that I wanted to go, but I didn't quite know how to access it. And the internet has changed that. I remember when it started to happen, but even then, there's something that happens in a personal dynamic. And I think especially these days, parents are really worried and concerned about the impact that the smartphone world is having on their kids. But on the other hand, it opens up a whole world, and if we can really develop a sense of ourselves and what our values are and who we are in the world, we can use these things as really potent tools to navigate our way in the world. And so if we could start to deconstruct even the idea of school, because I think in many ways, forgive me for saying this, I think we rely on institutions as a pacifier. the world has changed and things are uncomfortable, and we can look at it as a really scary thing that we should just not rock the boat and keep doing things the way we've been doing it. Or we can look around and say, like, you know, the world's actually changed quite a bit. And maybe it's this really fantastic, maybe this is being alive. Maybe this is being like fully us. And to have all kinds of different options for that, that's been my goal for the Learning Choices Network. So if I'm a kid from Alaska who wants to go someplace and experience a different culture, I can go to a place like Buffalo or a place to Austin, Texas, or anywhere that kind of sparks my attention, and have a network of community resources and individuals who have this appreciation for innovation and creativity and critical thinking, and are able to challenge and support that in a way that keeps me on task, but also has a respect for who I am as a person. And so with the network, we're really working to establish that kind of infrastructure in Buffalo, because we are a Rust Belt city, because we're the perfect example of what happens when you rely on one or two major industries, and then when you leave, what it means to redefine yourself. And we've got these amazing cultural resources in Buffalo that people don't even know about yet. They may have even grown up in Buffalo, but you know, if you lived in Buffalo and now you've left it, and you haven't heard about all the things that are happening. And whenever we redefine ourselves, there's a certain lack of certainty. We're not quite sure how things are going to go, but that's the things that are really growing and happening in the world are really led by people with the conviction to do something about it, something that's better. And I think that offering your child the opportunity to figure that out themselves are the best tools that you can offer them, so that they're in the best position possible 10 years from now for whatever jobs exist, or whatever the world's like, whatever opportunities we have available then that we can never imagine right now. I think we've got to start with defining what success is. And to define success by our own terms and our own life experience, and use that as a starting point. And then to really take the time to puzzle out what's the long-term objective. And I think we've got to be clear as possible about those things, and start with that, so that when you're at a crossroads of trying to decide what's the best decision, you're keeping the bigger picture in mind. And to think about it in terms of where your child's at and what do they want. Because you might do it perfectly for your first child, and then your next child comes along and they are so completely different in every way that you can't even start to do the same things and have it work out the same way. But if you just define what success is, and you define what the long-term objective is, and then you start to consider what's true for this particular person and what you can do to best support and facilitate their growth and their development, well, now you're doing something that it's a skill development, asset development. It's something that never goes away. And so you've got the opportunity to really test skills right now when the risks aren't too terrible. I mean, that's the thing, right? It feels like right now there's just, if you're not ready and confident to make a different decision yet, it's because you've got this sense of uncertainty and that the risk is too far. But when you start to think about the bigger picture, what are the bigger risks that we're taking on by not doing something different? And so it's up to every person, right? Like, you got to start somewhere. And I love, we quote this all the time, but Albert Einstein's thing, if you keep doing the same thing over and over and over again, you're going to keep getting the same results. And when you start to read about what Einstein thought about education and the fact that schools really didn't do much for him, shall we say. You start to look at every person who's really done something that has improved the quality of our lives. We're all human, right? But we've all got to navigate that path for ourselves. So you've got to try something different, and then you learn from that, and that informs your next choice, which is a better, more informed choice. But if you try to control everything and keep it just the same, how much learning is really going on over the next decade or the next 5 years? Because with college costs being what they are, or the job market being what it is, if you're not adaptable, what have you really got? So let's start that process now, and then let's build a bit more knowledge and experience so we've got it to refer to for the rest of our life.